whilst here on FM, it's your chance to call Jonathan Dimbleby.
Hello and welcome to this special programme which replaces any questions and any answers. It's a programme for you to say what you think about the invasion of Iraq. With me here in the studio is Rosemary Hollis, a specialist in Middle Eastern security issues and head of the Middle East programme at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. She's here to help us with matters of contentious fact and technical issues that you may raise. The lines are still open. The line number is 08700 100 444. We've got lots of calls, starting off with George Weiss from Hampstead in London. Mr. Weiss.
Good afternoon to you, Jonathan. Thanks for taking my call. Unlike the 400 or so MPs whose votes gave the green light to this appalling aggression, I believe the Stop the War marches represent majority British public opinion and should be listened to.
Aren't you shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted now?
No, because before they were saying stop the war and the war hadn't started. Now that the war has started, then stop the war seems to make much more sense. And it's not just British public opinion, it's opinion around the world. And I think more and more people are becoming aware it's the people that have power in this world who are responsible for the terrible state that the world is in.
Thank you very much. Sheila Nadima Sahan from London.
Good afternoon. I mean, I'm absolutely appalled, as a Scot who is married to a Middle Eastern gentleman, the fact that Tony Blair has decided to go to war on what I believe is not a legal footing. 14 members of the British Army have now dead. And for what purpose? We're told that this war is to save the Iraqi people. Yet if you watch the television, the only thing is, it's a video for American arms manufacturers. I do not believe that no matter what they do in Iraq, there will be peace. The Palestinians have, fed this fig leaf that George Bush will now sort of rein in Sharon.
Sorry, I cut you off there rather inadvertently. I was just going to bring in Rosemary Hollis on that point about the Palestinians as a fig leaf. But the roadmap, as it's called, to peace has been promoted, and the British government is saying, Rosemary, that it's going to be absolutely critical that this is carried through. You've been looking at that issue for a very long time.
Well, the 4 members of the quartet that have worked on this roadmap for restarting peace negotiations include the Russians, the UN, and the European Union and the Americans. But of those, the Americans have set a number of conditions which interfere with the roadmap going forward, including the Palestinians having to appoint a prime minister who is acceptable to the Americans, and including giving the Israelis another right to rethink the roadmap, as well as the Palestinians, who say they're already satisfied with it. So there are some big issues as to whether this is going to go into smooth implementation once the Iraq war is finished.
Thank you. Halal Jalabi from London.
Hello. Yes, actually, I come from Iraq. I thought to point that this war, there is no alternative for this war because Saddam has no intention to use the diplomatic route. He was playing. He has no intention to. He was playing a cat and mouse game to prolong the diplomatic until there is create this division between Western allies. And
you didn't think he was getting somewhere?
Yes, well, Saddam, he cannot be trusted. Saddam, Jonathan. Before the first Gulf War invasion of Kuwait, he told Hosni Mubarak, president of Egypt, that he's not going to promise him to invade Kuwait. 24 hours later, he invaded Kuwait. It's a charade, this question of inspection. Iraq is a large country. He's prepared to do it anything. He has no intention. He was asked by Arab country to leave the country, to leave the country and avoid this war. He has no intention. So therefore, there is no alternative to this war, I think. It is the question, the Iraqi people will be far better after the end of this war because there is a possibility of a democratic future for them. That is the only thing. Now, what is happening in Iraq now? I think Saddam is trying to use the Iraqi civilian as a human shield. And there is possibly this reluctance of uprising. But I presume since, because this tyranny of Saddam has created tremendous fears. I mean, Iraqi are even frightened of their shadows, you know.
What do you
So
think
the
they would be
question
thinking
is-
of the shock and awe bombing campaign if you were an Iraqi living in the centre of Baghdad?
Yes. Well, this question, of course, that things, you know, but they are hitting actually the palaces of the regime, the symbol of the regime. Of course, this is frightening, the things, but they haven't hit in civilian. I think possibly Saddam would love the allies, British and American plan, to hit civilian population so he could create, through television and outrage, encourage the anti-war movement. Unfortunately, the anti-war movement has played into his hands, unfortunately, because they did not make it explicitly. They are not only against war, but against his dictatorship.
Okay, thank you very much. A couple of emails now. This from Carol Bibawi, who writes, I'm 56 years old and have never been involved in political protest before. Resistance to this war began last year. I'm one of the many who can see that it's simply wrong. Now that it's begun, I mourn the fact not only that people will die, but that people will kill, thereby brutalizing themselves and diminishing their humanity. I've always believed that the main purpose of this war was not to eliminate weapons of mass destruction or to combat terrorism or to rescue the Iraqi people. I believe the main purpose has been to extend Western American so-called civilization. In much the same manner as those who built the British Empire often believed they were doing what was best for the world, I believe the American administration and much of the American people believe they have the best way of life the human race has yet developed and that everyone should embrace it. The present display of American invincibility will only increase the feelings of helplessness, powerless, hopelessness and despair among all the peoples of the world who see their way of life being swallowed up in an unstoppable tide of materialism and consumerism, backed up by irresistible military might. This is the despair that leads to fury, hatred and violence. And very differently from that, from George Eales, for the very first time I speak to make my opinion known. I'm tired of people portraying Bush and Blair as the villains. The only villain is Saddam Hussein and his evil regime. Let the freedom forces topple this regime, stop the massacre of innocent people by this despot, and let the US and UK forces make the world a safer place. Let's be thankful that we have a true leader as our Prime Minister, and let the whinging stop. Evan Prentice from St Albans.
Hello. I agree with your previous caller that Saddam Hussein is a tyrant, but I think that this is not sufficient reason to bomb the country. I would say Ariel Sharon's human rights record isn't glittering. But one of my main reasons for opposing the war is that I'm a journalist and I was in Kosovo when NATO bombed there, and I was on the wrong end of a NATO bombing myself. My driver was killed. When I'm watching the TV pictures that look almost like a firework display of the bombing of Baghdad, I have vivid recollections of what it was actually like to be in the middle of a series of 5 bombs going off. I don't think people sitting here watching the television can have any concept of the awesome power and fear that these bombs generate. And of course, the people who are most frightened are the civilians and huge numbers of children.
Do you think it's possible that the civilians can both be frightened and regard the bombing as a demonstration, as this government would wish, of the will to remove Saddam Hussein and the liberation thereby of themselves?
I think that there will be some people, of course, who will think that, but the fear is so overwhelming, even if you're afraid on behalf of your children, that I truly think that the overwhelming feeling will be one of, at the very least, trepidation and probably sick dread.
Thank you very much. Pat Traynor now from Loch Lomond, Scotland.
Yes, hello. My concern is for the Iraqi Kurds in the light of the reported Turkish incursion into the northern region. We could say so much about American fundamentalism, not least of all the hypocrisy of its application of human rights in Palestine, but it's apparent that some deal has been made with the Turks, because the Turks failed to convince their own people to accept the US bribe. You know, there were billions of pounds, I gather, in it, to allow their troops and air power access from Turkey. So at least the Turkish people had some voice for their protest, unlike the Brits. As you know, the Turks have a horrific human rights record, apparently 3rd or 4th on the bad list, according to Amnesty International. And my mother 3 weeks ago, and she's almost 90, said, when I was saying how relieved I was that the deal was off with the Turks and the Americans, she said, well, the US will let them in anyway, because they'll do some deal to let them into, let the Turks in to the northern region so they can gain control and keep the balance of power so that their Iraqi Kurds, their Kurds, I should say, don't get any foothold in Turkey.
Pat Traynor, I'm going to bring in Rosemary Hollis on this. We heard the Pentagon saying, the Defence Secretary saying that it was notably unhelpful if Turkey has sent troops, and there's some doubt about whether they have gone in or whether they haven't gone. A lot of contradictory signals. How alarming is it if the Turkish army does go in, and why?
It's alarming because they could start a war within a war. The Turks have observed the way the Kurdish community in northern Iraq has enjoyed a level of autonomy unprecedented there, and have been running their own small political and economic system. They believe, the Turks believe, that were those Kurds in northern Iraq to be able to also get control of some of the oil fields in the north, then they would be on the road to independent statehood. That's what they want to prevent. They want to ensure that the Kurds are subordinated to the central government of Baghdad in the aftermath of this war. The Kurds see the Turks as just anti-Kurd, period, and believe that they are coming into Iraq to pursue their own material interests, including possibly taking territory and oil. That's probably not true, but these two are never going to trust each other.
And that's why you would get, in addition to the inevitable chaos after war, yet another ingredient that could make the chaos last much longer.
Well, it would cut across the American plan to open a northern front, which is about liberating the whole of Iraq, as they would have it, and setting up a government which would probably be federal. And this would cut across both their military plans and their political plans.
Chris Wright now from Paris.
Hello there. Yes, I take the point on the Kurds, and interesting to hear about the lady who was in Kosovo as well. I can only say I think that the bottom line here is we have to get rid of Saddam. I mean, just imagine if we'd said in 1939 we said, well, Hitler, or in 1936 we said Hitler isn't an immediate threat. Said the same in 37, said the same in 38. In 1939 we were caught on the hop. The French were caught on the hop. It will be too late. We have to get rid of Saddam. I would want to.
Do you think there's a genuine parallel between Hitler, who had moved out of his own state with an avowed urge to expand and with a massive armaments program which had not been contained, is comparable with Saddam Hussein, who has been under pretty close watch for the last 12 years?
I don't think there's a direct parallel, but there is a parallel, because, Jonathan, the situation, the geopolitical situation has changed now. Saddam is a threat to his own people, but he is a potential threat to so many other people. And the proof of this is obviously what we've been saying with the Kurds, how the Iraqi situation is drawn into the Kurdish situation, it's drawn into the Middle East and the Israeli, the Palestinian situation. The Turks are being drawn in. It's not just about Iraq. The bottom line problem here is Saddam. We have to come to the Kurdish problem afterwards. The point I primarily wanted to make, I would have hoped that the UN... I wanted the UN to sanction the war, basically, because I see them, they're supposed to be the arbiter of international law as I see it. But I blame the UN because they're structurally flawed. How can we take, when you go to the permanent members of the Security Council, how can we take the views of Putin seriously? Where were the peace protesters in London when he was bombing old ladies in Grozny in Chechnya a few years ago? He's been doing exactly the same thing and worse. He's killed far more civilians than the Americans are going to do now. We hope at least the Americans are trying not to kill civilians. That was never the case with Russia. Russia's a permanent member of the Security Council. How can we take the Chinese seriously with their human rights record among their own people? And in Tibet, they have no democratic legitimacy themselves. When they go to the UN, their ambassador comes in from the Communist Party and says, this is what China thinks.
This suggests, Chris Wright, that you believe there's no purpose for the UN unless it can be entirely constructed of holier than other states.
Well, I wouldn't like... I mean, I take your point, but, I mean, can we not do better than Russia and China? What about the French? The French intervene in Africa when they feel like it. They don't mind what the UN says. What about the Americans? I mean, I'm the last person on earth to go and say we should all bow down to the Americans, simply because you go back to 1967, UN Resolution 242, the Israelis should withdraw from the occupied territories.
Okay, thank you. Martin Parfitt now from Birmingham.
Hello there. Hello there. My brother is in the TA and is currently serving in Iraq and was most probably one of the first people into Iraq with 42 Commando. It stresses me that we haven't got 100% support from the citizens of the United Kingdom. Our soldiers do need this support. They run on adrenaline. If they can have the support, we can get this conflict over sooner rather than later. We mustn't forget also that many of the soldiers are not individually full-time soldiers. They come from all walks of life. My brother, for instance, he's a fund manager. But he's also a territorial and prepared to sacrifice his life for his country.
You don't think that he has enough of the self-discipline that a soldier requires to both obey orders and not to need, as it were, a lot of stroking from back home?
No, I'm sure that they've had everything instilled in them over the last 2 to 3 months, that they are now a serious fighting machine. And, of course, they're going to come back to ordinary jobs. My only hope and prayer is that Rotary's motto at the end of all this campaign is that peace the world over will ultimately prevail. I hope that we don't find just another conflict somewhere else with another tyrant. But certainly Saddam Hussein has got to go. He doesn't think with his brain. He does action. He don't think he ever thinks.
Martin, perfect, thank you. A couple of emails now relating to that. This is from Nancy Holdsworth. I'm so fed up, she writes, of the lobbies, politically correct, bleeding hearts, etc., giving the impression that they're speaking for the majority in this country. I know that I've not been asked my opinion, neither have many of the people I've spoken to. Nobody wants war, nobody wants our troops to fight and die, but in this particular context, for once, Tony Blair's right. I'm not a Blair fan, but the way he's handled this very difficult situation has been admirable, and maybe he's turning into the statesman he ought to be. As for the school children leaving the classroom to protest, as an ex-teacher, I know that kids would leave the classroom to protest about Father Christmas if they thought they could get away with it. It's just more exciting than having to work. Let's stop taking too much notice of this vulnerable minority and support our troops and government. I can imagine what would happen if they tried those antics on the streets of Baghdad. But, as it were, in response from Naomi Greterex, who's 15 years old and a schoolgirl, I've been involved in campaigns such as Drop the Debt. I've visited Palestine and Israel. I've listened to and read the opinions of world leaders, reporters and so on. I feel I'm quite able to make up my own mind about an issue such as the war in Iraq. I know I'm not alone in this. Along with a number of friends, I joined over 1,000 young people on a protest march in Sheffield. Why am I protesting? I believe that the use of such violence is unjustified. It will only harm the millions of Iraqi people who are already suffering. Half of Iraq's people are young people. Surely it's up to the young people of this country to speak out on their behalf. I'm lucky enough to live in a country that prides itself on freedom of expression. I'm amazed and angry that so many schools, including my own, feel unable to support their students when we want to express our opinions about what is happening in Iraq. What happens today in the world is our future. Jill Wood now from Northwick in Cheshire.
I'm calling from my dual experience of my brother dying aged 21 as a pilot, and how it affected me, and later I qualified as a counselling psychologist, so I've seen it from the other end of the telescope as well. And I wanted to say that for people who want to help people who are suffering the loss of somebody close to them who they loved, that they do need a lot of support, but that doesn't mean that they want to be talked to. That it means understanding that initially they may be in very deep shock, that in my case my life was totally dislocated. I think and hope that counselling has moved on since then, not just counselling but people's attitude. I also particularly would ask that children be considered, and young people, that the amount of support that they will require, and this may just be the security of somebody being there, a quiet place, somewhere where they can grieve in security in the first instance. And adults, of course, also need help. Anybody, it may not be just mothers and fathers or brothers and sisters, but in addition to the children, there may be partners, loved ones, maybe secret loved ones who only close friends know about.
Jill Wood, most people I'm sure listening to that will say amen to what you've said, the need to support those who have suffered because they've lost their loved ones. Thank you. Keith Litchfield now from Birmingham.
Thank you for this opportunity to freedom of expression.
No problem.
I'd like to make two brief points. The first is regarding the protesting school children who actually prevented me from getting to work this week. I'm thinking of organising a sit-down protest of scantily dressed schoolgirls to line the road outside the Saddam Hussein Mosque. Yes, that's the Saddam Hussein Mosque here in Birmingham, and scream meaningless platitudes at the congregation and the management committee of the Saddam Hussein Mosque as they attempt to exercise their right to enter the mosque and pray. I call upon the management committee of the Saddam Hussein Mosque to paint the dome pink and rename the mosque the fluffy, lovely Princess Diana Mosque.
Okay.
This is obviously a humorous point, but
I can see very heavy humour at best.
Could I make my other point?
Yep.
I'm not a supporter of New Labour or Tony Blair. I never have been. I do support these efforts to get rid of the regime and obviously remove the weapons of mass destruction. I would just say very briefly that I think a very large majority of law-abiding people in this country would say to Tony Blair, the IRA have killed a lot more British soldiers, policemen and civilians than Saddam Hussein ever has.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Sonia Christensen from Hull.
Well, at first, thank you for letting me talk to you, but I'm a bit shocked by the last speaker, and I better not respond to this. I have experience of bombing, and I know that a city like Dresden, for example, can be rebuilt in 40 to 50 years. And I know that a lot of horrible suffering can be forgotten, and a place like Germany, 50 years later, can arise out of the ashes. But what I cannot, and I've thought hard about this, cannot see, and that's why I'm against this war, and I do call it immoral and certainly illegal, is the political consequences of it. I cannot see that democracy and can be bombed into a country. It's extremely difficult to rule a country so full of conflicts. And I think we should have better understanding that democracy doesn't reduce conflict, it may actually increase them. We haven't discussed this whole idea that we can create democracy in the world simply by our political and military will. I certainly now believe, and I think the first signs have already come, that there will be military success, there may be economic and commercial success, but this will be a major political failure and a major political defeat for the Blair government. And I think this is a nice word coined by one of the FT journalists, Stefan Fiedler, a catastrophic success. I think it has already started with the Turks going into the north of Iraq. It has started, I think, from what we just hear, Claire Short's latest news, that the Americans will not respect or invite the United Nations to play its proper role in the rebuilding and reconstruction.
Sonia Christensen, I'm going to bring in on the important points you raised, Rosemary Hollis from the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The issue of democracy or not democracy is one that is hugely controversial within the sort of expert establishment as well as between governments and peoples. Do you reckon that the hope of achieving democracy in Iraq, as the Americans insist, is realistic?
Well, as the caller has mentioned, there are a number of cross-cutting factors, and it's very difficult to imagine that the United States can retain full control of developments in Iraq, let alone the rest of the region. Iraqis, many of them, would say that that regime was built up in part because of the involvement of external players, and that therefore those external players may be needed to intervene to topple it. They may not be able to topple it themselves. Having done so, however, they would not identify with the US goal of bringing democracy. They would simply wish to take back control of their own affairs. And this is what we wait to see, if the Americans can leave quickly enough to allow the Iraqis to pick up the pieces.
If they do pick up the pieces, we hear a lot from Iraqi exiles here of the need for freedom, transparency and democracy. Is the question control, but perhaps democracy, perhaps not?
I think the problem is that if the United States is in sole control, with or without British assistance, this will be seen as imperialism across the region. It will be seen as them controlling the situation for their own benefit. and their idea of democracy has to do with client states. This is how it's perceived. Therefore, it would be better if there was international involvement. The British Prime Minister is correct in identifying the fact that if it was a United Nations trusteeship for transition to a new Iraq, that would have more legitimacy than a US trusteeship.
And that it appears to be the case that so far Claire Short has been in America on exactly this issue, and she's got a rather dusty answer from the Pentagon. Nick Blanche now from Stroud in Gloucestershire.
Hello, Jonathan.
Hello.
I was very disappointed, really, actually, coming to Claire Short, but actually Glenda Jackson. Very disappointed in her response, being interviewed on Radio 4 earlier today. She likened the Saddam Hussein regime to a butterfly. It's just not credible, Glenda Jackson's stance.
She wasn't actually, to be fair to her, she wasn't likening the regime to a butterfly. She was likening the power of Iraq relative to the power of America, wasn't she?
I think, point taken, but I think she grossly underestimates Saddam Hussein's evil. And it's just disappointing for a member of the government. She should resign, really, if she feels that strongly about it. She should support Tony Blair. They've moved heaven and earth to try and avoid this war. The conduct of the war thus far has been excellent. They've shown great restraint, actually. I'd be interested to hear what Miss Hollis thinks of that so far. And I also think Claire Short, really, she should have resigned too. Only John Denham comes out of this with any honour. It's very disappointing.
Robin Cook, you exclude? Because he led the way in resigning, didn't he, like John Denham? I'm
not so sure. I think there's a bit of a Machiavellian... I think Robin Cook knew he was due for the push anyway. But I think there's a bit of a Machiavellian manoeuvre there, really, ready for a leadership battle. But that's another issue.
What did you want to hear from Rosemary Hollis?
Whether she thought the conduct of the war thus far is actually... they're doing very well to try and get the message across against great odds. You know, that we're not trying to conquer Iraq. We're trying to allow them to regain the control of their own country from this evil monster.
Briefly on that, Rosemary.
It is a new type of war. It's being the use of military instruments to send a political message, and we wait to see how it pans out.
Thank you. Mary Bruce now from Chorleywood in Hertfordshire.
I have relatives in Baghdad, my in-laws. I lived in Iraq for 2 years and have visited Iraq since I left. I in fact came in the day after the regime that brought the coup that brought Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party to power, and have seen it develop over many years. I'm absolutely distraught by what is going on. I myself have got terminal cancer. A few days ago I received a bunch of flowers from my brother-in-law in Baghdad, telling me that he and the rest of his family were praying for me, which I thought was very sweet. The situation is, as I can see it, that America thinks, because it is the only superpower, that it can do anything it likes anywhere. We have seen the United States deliberately support and uphold some of the most barbaric regimes, in fact, place some of the most barbarous people as heads of states throughout Latin America and in Indochina. It's pure crocodile tears for them to complain about the sort of person that Saddam Hussein is. Yes, I agree, he is a bastard, but he's one of very many. The idea that the United States and Britain can totally overrule the weapons inspector's report. Hans Blix was interviewed yesterday on the Today programme. He stated quite clearly that since they had arrived there in November of 2002, until they were eventually called out, they had had nothing but full cooperation from the Iraqi authorities.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Mary Bruce. Very briefly, Dr. Erica Hunter from London. I'm afraid we're almost out of time, but could you just make your point in a moment or two?
Yes, I wanted to say that prior to the Gulf War, there was no illicit looting of antiquities from Iraq. A massive hemorrhaging which happened after the Gulf War, and the Iraqis have a very effective Department of Antiquities that has tried very hard to stop this. I fear very much for the situation, not only for the people, but of course also for antiquities, what will happen, looting of museums, monasteries, in the breakdown of law and order, let alone the destruction of the Iraq Museum in the Blitz. Many objects have been moved. but many items could not be moved because they simply are built into situ, or they simply don't have the storage spaces to move their items.
Dr. Erica Hunter, you sound as if you're at that demonstration in Hyde Park. Thank you very much for calling us. I know that huge numbers of you have tried to get through, and with the emails as well, but there is an intense debate